So, Boker Tov L'Kulam, good morning, Chodesh Tov. We've got a new month. We just started a new reading of the Torah, and I hope all these new opportunities lead to, shall we say, a greater spring in our step. It's been a tough few months, and although we're learning online, I hope we can bring more energy to perhaps what's been a challenging period of time. I'm really thrilled to be teaching here for Matan, and I'm thrilled to continue my association with Matan Bet Shemesh and under the sterling leadership of Melissa. And I'm also delighted to start learning a new Sefer with you. It's not a new book, but it's the first time I'm sharing my thoughts on the Sefer Hachinuch. At the end of last semester, I asked those who participated in our share what work we wanted to continue learning, and this was a suggestion. And then Matan kindly opened up our learning to everybody, for people not just in Bet Shemesh. And so I'm delighted to have some new faces joining our learning. So to go through again, my name is Johnny. I'm originally from London. I live in a place called Even Shmuel, which is a yeshuv not far from Kiryat Gat. I teach in seminaries, and as I say, I'm delighted to be sharing my thoughts today. And what I want to do in today's learning is go through a mitzvah as presented by the author of the Sefer Hachinuch, and try and understand what he contributes to the understanding of this mitzvah. But before we do so, I want to introduce the book and perhaps answer any specific questions you may have. Just before doing so, in the chat box beforehand, I sent a link to a daf makarot, to a source sheet. Now, you don't need that source sheet now. Everything there I'm going to be sharing, but if you want to download that, or if you want to print it, feel free to do so. So let's begin. And what is a Sefer Hachinuch? Well, the Sefer Hachinuch, and this is a summary I gave, hopefully whetting your appetite to choose this course, is a unique and exquisite book that addresses the mitzvot in detail, while also providing ethical, philosophical, and spiritual explanations for the mitzvot. That means the Sefer Hachinuch, and this is my copy, goes through each of the 630 mitzvot. And he gives both a summary of the laws and also a rationale. But what I love about this book isn't just the content, but also the tone. As Rabbi Dr. Isidore Epstein explains, it's a calm, beautifully tempered book, fully of tenderness, piety, and fervor, abundant in religious and ethical teachings and thought. That means I find the Sefer Hachinuch to be able to capture both law and poetry. He's able to eloquently and beautifully and delicately present some of those really tricky aspects of our obligations, of our mitzvot. And just before proceeding, you should know that though the Sefer Hachinuch is written in the 13th century, many commentaries on the Sefer Hachinuch have since been written. For example, the Minchat Chinuch, which I have here in my hand, and a further commentary, which I'll be quoting, called Me'ila Ephod, to name just two, and there's probably about 20 other commentaries on the Sefer Hachinuch. Now, in each mitzvah, the author addresses the mitzvah by telling us what is its essence. He begins by saying, ha-mitzvah, the mitzvah is. Then he begins by telling us a suggested reason for the mitzvah, what he calls Mishosheh mitzvah, of the roots of the mitzvah. Then he presents the laws, the details, Medinei ha-mitzvah. And at the end, he summarizes as to who the mitzvah applies. Does it apply to men and women, or just women, or just men? Does it apply to Kohanim and Leviim? Does it apply in Israel or across the diaspora? So that means that this breakdown serves to be highly useful in terms of understanding the notion of mitzvah, what it's all about, and whom is obligated in terms of its observance. Now, in terms of the authorship of the Sefer Hachinuch, it's a bit of a mystery. For quite some time, it was presumed that Rabbi Aaron Halevi of Barcelona was its author. In fact, the author in his preface does make it clear that he's a rabbi living in Barcelona, so that we know. But for various reasons, that's been debunked. Then it was suggested that his brother was the author, but others disagree. And as the author of this entry in the OU page, which was quite helpful in summarizing the background of the authorship of the Sefer Hachinuch, what's fascinating is, notwithstanding the anonymity of the author, the book still has been able to have a universal appeal and continued popularity, probably because of the clarity with which he brings to every mitzvah and the poetry in which he writes. So before we proceed, are there any important questions relating to the authorship, the breakdown, the history of the book? Obviously, our task is to be learning a mitzvah each week, and I'll be going through the text and going through the background sources informing his ruling. But if you have any questions, feel free to ask now. If not, I guess we're going to continue. One thing I would say before continuing is, it's called the Sefer Hachinuch, which literally translates as a book of education. And the author writes in his introduction, and I'm not going to go through it all here, which is, I decided that I decided, notwithstanding my limitations, Ishu Bet Levi Barcelona, a Levite, a Jewish Levite living in Barcelona, Lichtov HaMitzvot al Derech HaSidarim, to summarize each of the mitzvot in the order they appear in the Sidrot. And he says, and the reason I did this is actually because I wish to create a book of education. I wanted to write a book for my son and his friends. לעורר לב הנער בני סליחה והילדים חבריו בכל שבוע ושבוע אחר שילמדו אותו הסדר בחשבון המצוות. He said, I wanted to write a book so my son and his friends would basically grasp the mitzvot that arise in every parasha, so that they would have a sense of their purpose, so they wouldn't think the mitzvot are arbitrary, so they'd have an understanding of their rationale. That is, a Sefer Mitzvot isn't merely a list of mitzvot like Rambam provides. It's an argument for mitzvot. It's where he offers, as I say, shorshei mitzvot, roots of mitzvot, with the intention of making those mitzvot understandable and, where possible, attractive to younger people, but I think also to older people as well. Any quick thoughts?
Yeah, I have. Cindy here.
Yeah.
Nice to see you. I have, maybe it's just me, I don't want to sound like the difficult one, but I have an issue with the fact that we don't know who wrote it. Like, how can we learn, I'm being a devil's advocate here, but how can we learn a book if we're unsure of the author? How do we know it's reliable?
So first and foremost, there are times when people disagree with the Sefer Hachinuch, just like they disagree with people whom we know about. People disagree with the Rambam, and we knew perfectly well who the Rambam was. It's one of these things where the content was so impressive that the authorship, we kind of knew it was an important person living in this time. That was given, 13th century Barcelona, we know that. And notwithstanding that lack of certainty as to who wrote that, and perhaps there was a time when people did know, but obviously nowadays that information has been lost, the content, the tone, the clarity of the book made it a must-have on the Jewish bookshelf. I would say, by the way, there are actually more than a couple of books whose authorship is either anonymous due to historical forgetfulness or anonymous out of choice. Ben Ish Chai, for example, wrote a book of responsa, and he chose not to sign off his responsa by his own name. There are other works where people chose to write a book and said, if it has legs, fantastic, but I'm not going to put my proper name to it. So that's a whole talk unto itself, the anonymizing of Jewish books, either deliberately or due to historical reality. But nonetheless, it's really what was said before, that the tone, the content, the clarity of the Sefer Hachinuch makes it almost immaterial. And that's why I will say the author of the Sefer Hachinuch, rather than necessarily knowing who it was. It makes it, shall we say, both more mysterious, but also less personal. I'm interested in the ideas. It's not so much about the authority of that person, but legitimacy of what they say. I actually think in many ways it makes it more helpful. I don't get scared to criticize the author of Sefer Hachinuch because I'm not worried who that is. I'm just interested as to whether what they say makes sense. Any further thoughts about this, or him writing the book for his son, or anything like that? Okay. Well, guess what? We are going to deal with a mitzvah every week. And I thought that today, as we just started Shabbat Bereshit, we would start with mitzvah number 1. By the way, I have to tell you, I do have a deep affinity to the Muppets and Sesame Street. So if on occasion I accidentally let my enjoyment get the better of me, please forgive me. Anyway, so the count tells us it's mitzvah number 1. And what is mitzvah number 1 in the Torah according to the Sefer Hachinuch? And let's be very, very clear. There are other records of mitzvot. And one thing we're going to learn even from today is, whoever the author of the Sefer Hachinuch was, he was an independent thinker. He didn't merely regurgitate the opinions of other authorities who lived beforehand. Don't forget, by the 13th century, we've already got the Rambam. We've already got the Gaonim. We've already got the Ramban, all of whom have said important things. We've already had Rashi. And where the author of Sefer Hachinuch says something different, it tells us this person doesn't mind going out on a limb. And so the first mitzvah, according to the Sefer Hachinuch, is a mitzvah of pru'urvu, of having children. And that's what we're going to be focusing on for basically the next hour. Now, I must make it clear, this is the sum total of the text of the Sefer Hachinuch on the mitzvah of pru'urvu. Technically, we could read it in 5 minutes and go home, although actually we're all home, so whatever. But what we're going to do is understand why he says what he says. In many ways, understand what is original in this presentation of the law. And in so doing, gain a deeper appreciation of dimensions of the mitzvah of pru'urvu, which perhaps over time we'd not paid much attention to. And I can tell you, in preparing the shiur, there were things I was looking at and saying, how come I never knew that? That's pretty important. So that's what I want us to do. And so here we have the text of the first mitzvah in the Sefer Hachinuch, the mitzvah of Pirya V'Ribya, which we generally translate as be fruitful and multiply. And he says, Bereshit yesh ba mitzvah aseh achat. In Parshat Bereshit, there's one positive mitzvah. Obviously, we know a positive mitzvah is a mitzvah to do, a negative mitzvah is a mitzvah not to do. V'hi mitzvah Pirya V'Ribya. This is the mitzvah of being fruitful and multiplying, shene'emar, as it says, v'yivarech otam Elokim, v'yomer lahem Elohim pru'urvu. And God blessed them, and he said to them, be fruitful and multiply. So far, so good? Everyone okay with that? Well, of course. He's saying we learn be fruitful and multiply from the verse that says, be fruitful and multiply. Nothing surprising there. And then he goes on to say, Mishosha mitzvah, of the roots of the mitzvah, meaning he's going to give a rationale of sorts. Kadesh ya'olam yushav, that God wants the world inhabited. Shashem baruch hu chafetz b'yishuvah, God desires the world being populated. Kedichtiv lo tov bar'al asher yitra. I didn't create basically an empty world. Instead, says Isaiah, quoting, of course, a teaching of God, I created the world that it would be filled. This is a grand mitzvah on which all the other mitzvot, shall we say, are derived or exist. Without people, you can't keep mitzvahs. This is an important principle. The Torah is given to human beings, not heavenly angels. He goes on to say, Dinei mitzvah, what are the laws of the mitzvah? Matai chayav adam la'asok ba. When must a person involve themselves in this mitzvah? You know, we involve the mitzvah with the mitzvah of sukkahs at Sukkot, right? And matzah on Pesach. Right? How many children do you need to have in order to then fulfill your duty? And which mitzvah make you exempt from this mitzvah? And all the other details. He says, he says all of that is clearly explained in these references in Yevamot and Brachot. He doesn't go through all the laws of Pirya V'Rivya. He's telling us that this is a mitzvah. Basically saying, this is a headline, you want more details, look there. Noheged b'chol makom v'b'chol zman. This mitzvah applies in all places, in all times. V'chayav adam nishtadel ba b'shura uila. And a person should endeavor in terms of fulfilling this mitzvah from when it's appropriate for them. And this is roughly from the age when the rabbi said a man should marry. Why do I say a man should marry? Because he concludes and he says, this mitzvah of having children does not fall on women. I'll just say that again in case you missed that. However, a man who is obliged to fulfill this mitzvah, who actively refrains from fulfilling this, has refrained from fulfilling a Torah mitzvah, a mitzvah taseh, and his punishment is very great. Because basically, he's choosing not to do what God wants us to do. Now, this is it. This is the Sefer Hachinuch on Parashat Bereshit, on the Mitzvah of Pirya V'Rivya. And what we're going to do is try and unpack aspects of his presentation. And in so doing, reach some interesting conclusions, not just about him as a scholar, but also about the law as it applies to us. And I say us inclusively, not exclusively. Before proceeding though, any questions?
Hi, I hate to be the verbal one here, but general question about the whole idea of giving reasons for mitzvot.
Right.
Because if I understood correctly, in the Torah, Hashem doesn't give reasons for mitzvot, and he only gives reward for 2 mitzvot. Because the whole idea was that we're not supposed to favor a mitzvah over another. Was it acceptable for us to try to find the reasons, to explain them like he does in this book? Was there any, uproar over this type of behavior? Were there Rabbanim who were against behavior, this type of explanation? Were there Rabbanim who were against it?
So that's a great question, and I'm really pleased you raised it. The truth is, the Sefer Hachinuch is lucky that the furor began when Rambam offered explanations for many mitzvot, especially in his Moreh Nevuchim. And there was somewhat of a furor. How can you do that? But what he argues is, I'm not telling you this is the reason. I'm saying this is among the reasons I think are a good basis for keeping the mitzvot. That's why I think the headline that the Sefer Hachinuch almost always uses is Meshorashei HaMitzvot. It's not these are the roots of the mitzvot, these are among the roots. Meaning these are the things which I believe are reasons for doing what we do, but I'm not giving you a definitive guide. And if you recall, this goes back to his intentionality of writing this book. This is a Sefer Hachinuch, a book of education, trying to uplift his son and his friends to understand mitzvot and observe them. And he believes that you do need to give an argument, a reason, a rationale, an understanding in order for a mitzvah to be attractive. He says that there in the Hakdamah. And so this is, shall we say, consistent with his educational approach and his philosophical approach. And though overall there is a problem when a person says this is why God does this, when a person suggests this is possibly why God could be doing this, asking this of us, requiring this of us, there is certainly a more tempered and less agitated response from the rabbinic consensus. That's okay. And the truth is, we see that not just by Rambam, but many other people as well. And so this is consistent with this wider philosophy.
Rabbi, could this be even considered a bit of a book of Kiruv?
Well, I think it's, or shall we say, it's a book to try and retain those who are observant, to remain observant as they go through their teens. You know, when you actually think about it, there's something quite majestic about the whole endeavor. Here's a father who says, I've got religious kids, but I know that they look at text different to me, and I know that they need more to sustain them and to attract them. And my job as a parent is to provide that. So I'm inspired by that project. So a kiruv means bringing somebody who's far near. But there is such a thing as kiruv krovim, keeping those who are near. So in that spirit, I do think that Sefer Hachinuch plays a role. And I also believe that it gives us a good model to emphasize the rationale of mitzvot, especially to those who perhaps aren't quite sure whether to buy into observance. Now, any quick thoughts about the actual mitzvah? Friends, I've just read to you the mitzvah of Pruah. I've told you why we're supposed to have children.
I have a question.
Yes,
I have a question. Okay, why aren't women commanded? It's the obvious question. Why only men?
Susan is right on the money. People, we're talking. This is matan. They took you at least 4 minutes. I was waiting for that. Are you kidding that women are exempt from the mitzvah of Pruah? I mean, I've been in a labor war, but I was the one watching, right? So I know that it wasn't me giving birth to our children. How can it be that women are not obliged in the mitzvah of Pruah? And that's something which we're definitely going to get to. Now, although that seems to be, shall we say, hard to comprehend, right? The person who carries a child and gives birth to a child isn't obliged to do either. We're going to see that there is, shall we say, a different perspective that Chazal speak of that perhaps we may be less familiar with. So I will definitely address that, but not just if that's the case and how that's the case, but why that's the case. What's the biblical basis? Any final thoughts? If not, we're going to rush on. So what I've done here in red is highlight the bits that I want to address in detail. I'm not going to speak about the rationale of having children and filling the earth. I think that makes sense. What I do want to do is talk about the verse that the author of the Sefer Hachinuch brings to support his assertion that we learn this mitzvah from Parashat Bereshit. And I'll also be discussing how this doesn't seem to apply to women, and also be discussing why this mitzvah only applies from when a man gets married. Just think about that. If a mitzvah is a mitzvah, let's just say it applies just to men for the sake, because that's how he presents it. Why isn't the mitzvah, initiating from age 13? Why is a bar mitzvah boy not told, go have children now? He's told to put on tefillin. So what's the rationale for the delay of fulfilling that mitzvah? So we're going to get to that as well. So I've already answered the question. I meant to change the slide. But anyway, how many times the Torah uses the words pru'uvu? The count says 4. Now I mention that because it's very interesting. We know the phrase pru'uvu, be fruitful and multiply. What we often forget is that phrase doesn't just appear once. It appears 4 times in the Torah. Twice in Parshat Bereshit, and twice in Parshat Noach. Let's have a look. In Bereshit, and we just read this on Shabbat, whether you were in shul and you heard it, or like me, you were at home, and I read it at home. We're told in chapter 1 of Bereshit, V'yivarech otam Elohim le'mor, and God blessed them, saying, Puru urvu umil'u et hamayim b'yamim va'of yirev ba'aretz. Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters, and the fowl shall increase in the land. And then later on in verse 28, V'yivarech otam Elohim, now referring to Adam and Chava, now dealing with day 6. It says, and God blessed them, V'yomer lehem Elohim, and God told them, Puru urvu umil'u et ha'aretz v'chivshua, and fill the earth and subdue it, and subdue all the animals in the waters and the fowl in the sky and all the wild animals that prowl the earth. Now, it's important to note both in verse 22 and verse 28, the 2 references of Pru'uvu in Parashat Bereshit. The verse begins with the words Vayivarech otam. Can you see that there? It begins, just to show you that I know how to use these annotation things. It begins with the words, and he blessed them. God blessed the people. He blessed the earth, he blessed Adam and Chava, and he instructed them, be fruitful and multiply. This will be very important for us in just a moment. Now later on in Parshat Noach, so you can see, I'm giving you a Dvar Torah not just for Parshat Bereshit, but also for Parshat Noach. So whatever happens, you've got something to say at the Shabbos table. Anyway, for Parshat Noach, the phrase Pruvo is also repeated twice. Here, V'yivarach Elohim et Noach, and God blessed Noach, ve'et banav, and his sons. V'yomer lahem Pruvo, and he says, be fruitful and multiply and fill the land. And then further on in chapter 9, he instructs them again, V'atem Pruvo shirtzu ba'aretz uvuva. Go and you be fruitful and multiply, teem on the earth, right? And have many children. So it's interesting, the Torah tells us this phrase 4 times. Now, let's see how good your memory game is. Which verse did the Sefer Hachinuch quote as being the proof text of the mitzvah? Was it the one in Bereshit? And if so, the first or the second? Was it the one in Noach, the first or second? Peoples, you got to be with me, right? You got to remember, we did the count. Is it in the Bereshit verse or is it a Noach verse? Let's start with that.
Well, it's on Parshat Bereshit, so it must be in Bereshit.
Libby, she knows. Peoples, that was like a giveaway. I can't believe that. I was waiting for. Thank you for the great answer. Parshat Bereshit, which one, by the way, first or second?
The second, because the first one applies to other living things.
Boom, peoples. There you go. That's what it means. Anybody who says you can't have an intense, enjoyable response on Zoom, they don't know. They're not Olivia. Yeah. Anyway, so correct. You have here the proof text of the Sefer Hachinuch is the second verse in Parshat Bereshit, where God blesses Adam and Chava and says, okay, interesting. Any questions about that? Truth is, when we're told the mitzvah of Pruvu, we're told about the mitzvah of be fruitful and multiply, most of us presume that must be the verse, right? That seems to be that the Sefer Hachinuch has got it right. However, let's have a look at Rashi. I want to look at Rashi both in his commentary in Parshat Noach and also the Rambam in his summary of the mitzvot. You can see, peoples, I prepared, yeah? Anyway, so I didn't just download this year, right? So Rashi in his commentary on Parshat Noach tells us, you know that original mitzvah of Pruvo in Parshat Bereshit, that's not a tzivui, that's not a commandment, it's a bracha. You know where the tzivui is? It's the second usage of Pruvo in Parshat Noach. That is, according to Rashi, this phrase that he's commenting on, Vatem Pruvo, which continues, Shirtzu ba'aretz uvuva, that is a biblical proof text of the mitzvah of having children. And all the previous verses, which begin with the words Vayivarech otam, are aspirational blessings, not instructional commandments. Now you may well say, well, who cares? Actually, there's quite a lot relying on which verse we choose, because we're going to see there are details in each verse which will have an implication on who are commanded and how are commanded, etc., etc. So according to Rashi, the tzivui is derived from the fourth of the 4 references of Pruvo. But not just Rashi says that. If you look at the Rambam in his Sefer Mitzvot, which is certainly at least as authoritative, if not more, than the Sefer Hachinuch, it says, HaMitzvah HaReishut Bet, the 212th mitzvah. Remember, Rambam doesn't organize mitzvot in terms of parsha. And so rather than it being number 1, according to the count in the Sefer Hachinuch, it's much, much later on in the Rambam's book. Anyway, the Rambam says the 212th mitzvah, it's the mitzvah to be fruitful and multiply, and to intend the continuation of humanity. That's what we refer as Piri Veribia. And then he says, and this is what we derive from Va'atem Puru Uravu. And if you'll notice, it says Bereshit Tet Zayin, which is a verse in Noach. So according to the Rambam, according to Rashi, in fact, I'm going to tell you more. According to the Ramban, Nachmanides, and according to Achai Gaon, in fact, according to, I think, Tosfot as well, all the major Rishonim living prior to the time of the Sefer Hachinuch actually say the mitzvah is not learned from Parshat Bereshit. Sure, then the sentiment, the spirit of the law, the notion, the concept of be fruitful and multiply, it's mentioned 4 times, but the actual commandment, the actual proof text, the actual source is from Parshat Noach, not from Parshat Bereshit. In fact, it goes so far such that the author of Me'ila Ephod, which is one of the commentaries on the Sefer Hachinuch, one actually that I have here on my desk, written by Rabbi David Pipano, who lived in Bulgaria, if I recall, originally from Turkey, then in Bulgaria, around 100 years ago. He says, "Tzrichim anu lavin dat Rabbeinu." We need to understand the mind of our master, meaning the author of the Sefer Hachinuch. He brings a verse from Sefer Bereshit. To bracha, but this verse is a blessing. It's not a commandment. Hefech kol hamefarshim. In fact, he's going against the grain of all the classic commentaries. He said, truth be told, and he's written a whole book of commentary on the entire Sefer Hachinuch. He says, I can't quite figure out why our master, the Shavak Konhinhu Rav Uta, why he basically put aside all the opinions of all these great rabbis, such as Rabbi Achai Gaon, the Rambam, Rashi, Ramban, and he says, and other Talmudic sources, and basically went out on almost a limb. And he leaves it as what he called tzarech in, meaning, I don't have a clear answer to that question. So we begin actually by understanding that the author of the Sefer Hachinuch, whomever he was an independent thinker. Rather than all these other commentaries quoting the mitzvah from Bereshit Perek Tet, Parshat Noach, the Sefer Hachinuch says we learn the mitzvah from Parshat Bereshit. Now there is some rationale for doing so. We're going to walk through that, and in so doing, get a better understanding of how he reads this mitzvah. You see, you can't really comment on the boundaries and obligations of a mitzvah until you know where it's learnt from, right? So those proof texts, which often we may well skip along, I think are fundamentally important. And in future weeks, and almost every time, we'll be looking at the verses that he quotes and asking ourselves, how is he reading the verse, right? Because that's surely essential. But the Sefer Hachinuch does have some basis.
So can I just ask a quick question? Are there no other mitzvot that also have the V'yavarech in front of them? You know, others that are counted as mitzvot?
To know that would make me more learned than I am. I can't think of one offhand, right?
Okay.
But it's a great homework. I'm going to do that. I'm going to try and figure out if there are any other mitzvot that begin with the words V'yavarech. What I do know is the Talmud is replete on trying to find compelling proof texts, and sometimes a verse will say something. They'll say, yeah, it says it, but that doesn't tell us that we need to do it. It just tells us it's a thing, right?
Okay.
And V'yavarech is a statement, God saying, I hope this happens. But does it really mean you need to make this happen? And the Sefer, so the Rambam and the Rashi and everybody else say that requirement, obligation, is derived elsewhere. So, Melissa, you've pointed out the Mitzvah of Shabbat. The truth is, yes, we're told that God blessed the Shabbat. The question is that the source of the chiyuv of Shmirat Shabbat? I don't think so. But you see, this makes us think, and one of the reasons I am actually really happy that we're learning Sefer Hachinuch is it's a really useful bridge into halachic reasoning, right? We're dealing with concrete mitzvot, but it gives us a window into how we learn mitzvot. Now, the Sefer Hachinuch does have, as I say, some basis for his argument. And I want to introduce you to, shall we say, one of the most important texts that is part of our analysis today. And this is a Mishnah and Gemara in Masechet Yevamot. And here we learn about this distinction between men and women. And here a verse is interpreted. So this is important exegetically, and it's also important legally. And it tells us the following. Ha'ish mutzuva al piri avaribia. This is a Mishnah. A man is obliged in the commandment of be fruitful and multiply. Aval lo isha. That's a clear statement by what we call the Tanakama, the first voice of the Mishnah. A man is obliged for pruruvu, a woman is not. Now, I'm well aware of the strangeness of the notion to say a woman is not obliged to pruruvu, she gives birth. We're going to get to that, I promise. But let's just deal with the legality of it, because we want to get to the mindset of this opinion and this position as seen in the Sefer Hachinuch. But this position here in the Mishnah is challenged by Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka. He says, Al Shneim, actually I disagree. Both men and women are obliged in the Mitzvah of Pruruvu, and guess which verse he quotes? He quotes the verse that the Sefer Hachinuch quotes. Now that suggests that the law could be derived from that verse. Unfortunately, and we're going to see later on, the law doesn't follow Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka. And in fact, the very fact that his proof text is rejected perhaps actually gives basis for why Rashi and Rambam are justified in quoting a verse from Parshat Noach. Nevertheless, this Mishnah certainly alludes to the possibility of seeing this statement, notwithstanding it being a blessing, as being a supportive verse for the chiyuv, for the duty. Now the Gemara proceeds and then asks the question, how did we derive this notion that women are not obliged to have children? Okay, and this is where things get interesting. Menahani mili, where did we get this from? This notion that only the man is obliged and not a woman. Right, so Rabbi Ilah quotes Rabbi Elazar, the son of Rabbi Shimon. And he says, we derive this detail from the end of that verse meaning chapter 1, verse 28. Because that verse concludes by saying, and fill the land and subdue it. To which the rabbis of the Gemara say, Ish darcho lifchosh, it is a way of a man to subdue, and it's not the way of a woman to subdue. Now, we could discuss it for months as to what that means. And by the way, there are many interesting interpretations, some of which I wouldn't quite buy into. But nevertheless, let's just simply say the rabbis are hooking their interpretation that only the man is obliged of peri veribia on the usage of the word v'chivshuha, which is at the end of chapter 1, verse 28. Now, the Gemara then challenges, says, that doesn't make sense because the word chivshuha sounds plural. Adarabba, on the contrary, v'chivshuha talte mashma, which means v'chivshuha implies two, implies men and women. Amar Rab Nachman bar Yitzchak, said Rabbi Nachman bar Yitzchak, v'chivshuha ketiv, there is no vav which suggests a plurality of instruction. It's written as if it's talking to a singular person, and consequently, the derivation is that v'chivshuha is directed to a singular person, namely the man, not the woman. Now, this sugya is fascinating and bothersome all at once. But for our purpose, there are two things I want to share, and then I want to hear your thoughts. Number one, this serves as evidence that chapter 1, verse 28 can be used, at least according to Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka, as a source for the mitzvah of pruruvu. And also, the source that women are not obliged in this mitzvah is interpreted from the word v'chivshuha, which is found at the end of that verse. Any questions about this? And if, by the way, I'm going too quickly, feel free to either tell me that or write me that. Please be blunt, because that's what I'm used to. Any thoughts, queries? Feel free to unmute yourselves.
Hi, Rav Johnny, it's Tanya.
Hi, Tanya, how's it going?
Good, Baruch Hashem. It's a beautiful day. I just wrote on the chat that kivshuha is in the female.
Yes, but it's referring to what you are, shall we say, what was the word I used? What a person is subduing, right? And subdue it, it's referring to the land, right? So the Kivshua is applied to the world or the animal kingdom. By the way, some even suggest it's Adam Kivshua towards the Chava. That I'm not going to get into. But what the key point here is, it's, although it sounds plural, it's written singular, and that's a basis for suggesting that even if this verse is a proof text, the end of the verse then says, both of you should be blessed to have children, but only you are obliged to, the one who is the Chivshua.
So then it's still not clear if it's supposed to be, who it's supposed to be for.
Well, the point is, either you take this verse as being a blessing, and that's what Rashi says, the Rambam says, although they do pay heed to the end part of the verse, v'chivshuha, but perhaps don't overplay that as being the singular proof text that women are exempt from puruvu. Or you do take this verse like the Sefer Hachinuch, but according to the traditional reading of this verse, the end part implies that only men are obliged with the mitzvah of puruvu, as derived from this, shall we say, creative reading or a midrashic reading, however you wish, of the word of chivshuha.
So basically, they're taking one verse to say the puruvu mitzvah, they're taking another verse to prove something else.
Well, if you're the Rambam and you're Rashi and Rabbi Achai going on the Ramban, then you're using chapter 9, verse 7 for the mitzvah, but you're using details in the previous verses to shape the mitzvah. If you're the Sefer Hachinuch, you're using just chapter 1, verse 28. Correct. Sorry, Linda, you wanted to say something?
Yes, if Kivshuha is singular, why isn't it just singular to the woman?
Well, that's an interesting question, because the answer, the way the rabbi's answer is, it's the way of a man to subdue, and it's not the way of a woman, meaning the very nature of the word is indicative as to whom it's speaking to.
That's not pshat, that's another,
attitude. This is how they're reading the verse. Remember, I believe this is really important stuff to understand how laws are derived. Now, oftentimes there'll be a forced interpretation. You're saying, you made the decision and then you found a verse to hook it on, shall we say. And there are other times where a mitzvah clearly is emerging from a verse or a phrase. Here, I think that there are aspects which come and aspects that don't come. But nevertheless, this is an important text in terms of formulating the mitzvah of puruvu. Any final thoughts? Because we do need to move on, notwithstanding the importance of this text and the need really to spend more time on it.
I want to say something. When you said that that verse 28.
I don't know who's got.
Okay, hold on. Can you hear me better now? Can you hear me better now?
Yeah.
Okay. When you said that verse 28 that starts with Vayivarech, it can't be used to say that that's the mitzvah, because it says, and God bless them. But it says, I mean, that's just the beginning of the verse. It says, Vayivarech Elohim vayomer lahem, and God blessed them, and he said to them, Pru'ervu. I mean, it's the same as in the Parshat Noach, where he also, and he said to them, Pru'ervu. So it says that here too. It just said he blessed them, and he said to them. So that's the mitzvah. It seems to me that's the mitzvah here too. Why can't you just use this? Why do you need Noach?
So firstly, thank you for a compelling argument that the Sefer Hachinuch is right. Meaning, I think there could well be a variety of reasons why Rashi and the Ramban and the Rambam choose the other verse. Maybe it's just more punchy. You know, a commandment is generally a punchy statement. If you've got 4 statements and one is the punchiest, perhaps you kind of say it must be that one. I don't disagree with the notion that Vayomer seems to be something that people have been told. You could also, though, argue that he's blessing them and telling them suggests it's just to them. Maybe the mitzvah needed to be speaking to a wider audience. But we're going to give further answers to this question in just a second. So I'd say that makes a lot of sense, that, shall we say, critique of the others, but hold that thought. What I do want to do is move on, because we've got a few more sources to get through, and point out one or two other commentaries, and then get to our concluding remarks, because the Radak, David Kimchi, actually seems to support the reading of the Sefer Hachinuch, though that the super commentary on the Sefer Hachinuch, the Me'ila Ephod, seemed to suggest, how could he say this? Nobody reads that verse that way. Actually, the Mishnah suggests you could read the verse that way. And the Radak says something similar. He says, Peruv will be fruitful and multiply. Hafriyahu halada, Rabbiyahu agdala. Interesting, he says, the word Priyah is about giving birth, but Ribiyah is about raising them, which is interesting. But he says, even though this is a blessing, as God blessed the fish kingdom, Samchu Chazal shehi mitzvah livnei adam. Our rabbis did invoke this verse, at least according to Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka, to suggest that we could derive the mitzvah from this verse. And then he goes on to quote the whole notion of a chivshuha, etc. And he says, I just want to point that out, because some people do say, yeah, it's a bracha, but it doesn't mean it can only be read as a bracha. So that's somewhat supportive of what's being said. But perhaps most interesting is the Meshech Chochmah. And the Meshech Chochmah is magnificent. Now, I have to tell you, you've probably heard a bit of this Meshech Chochmah before, but I don't know if you've ever studied all of it. So let's begin, and you'll see he has a whole rereading of Parshiot, Bereshit, and Noach, which I think, shall we say, helps us find a beautiful middle ground between either the Rambam and the Ramban and Rashi, all right, or the Sefer Hachinuch, and which verse?
Excuse me 1 second.
Yeah.
Would you be able to use your cursor so I can see where you're reading?
Great tip, and I'm going to do it now. You should see the cursor right now.
Thank you. Oh, it's great.
I should have used it before. I apologize. There's some these great tips. We're going to be exploring Zoom in future weeks, Bezrat Hashem. But let's start with this one here. So Meshech Chochmah is Meir Simcha Dvinsk, living just over 120 or so years ago. And in his Torah commentary, he says something, I'd say, both fascinating and radical about the mitzvah of Puruv, but then he adds a profound reading of the text. Now, the first bit, as I say, you may have heard, and he says, Lo achuk hu lemor, it's not far to claim, Hada Patra Torah Nashim Epiria Veribia, that the rationale, the reason why women were exempt from the obligation of having children, V'chayva rak anashim, and why only men were obliged. Ki mishpatei Hashem v'darchav darchei noam v'chol nitvadah shalom, because the ways of the Torah are ways of pleasantness and all her paths of peace. V'lo amsa al Yisraeli ma she'em b'yocholet haguf lekabel, and the Jew was not obliged to do things which would have been hard on their physical welfare. Im ken, therefore, nashim mistaknot be'ibur v'leda, women whose lives are risked through pregnancy and childbirth, and we forget the amount of people who died in pregnancy and childbirth in prior generations, and sadly still in certain times today. Mishum zeh amru mita shchicha. Based on this, the rabbi said, death is a frequent association with pregnancy and childbirth. Lo gazra Torah letzavot lepirot v'ribot al isha. The Torah did not require a woman to have children. So let's pause here for a second. The Meshech Chochmah says something interesting. Don't think the idea that women are not obliged to period of Veribia is as crazy as it sounds. Of course, we know that without women, you can't have babies. But the notion is the obligation couldn't be put on a woman who risks her life to be pregnant, who risks her life to give birth. You can't oblige somebody to endanger themselves. So you can say to a guy, your job is to try and have children. And you can say to women, if you're prepared to oblige, fine. but we're not going to require that of you. And that's a Meshech Chochmah's reading the mitzvah. And as I say, you may have heard that before, and I find that fascinating. But he proceeds, and in fact, he doesn't just say one thing, he says two things. Let's actually skip this, and I'm going to come back to the end. See this line, this bit I'm pointing to? I'm going to come back to that, please remind me. But then he goes on to say the following. Hachinuch sheba Adam v'Chava shiberech otam kodem achet. With Adam and Chava, God blessed them prior to the sin. At that point, womankind didn't have tsar leida, the pain of childbirth. At that point, both of them were included in the mitzvah. And that's the simple reading of chapter 1, verse 28. Both are being spoken to. And he told them, you shall be fruitful and you shall multiply. He says, but if you proceed and then look at Parshat Noach, after the sin, after the point where she began, and womankind began to experience the pain of childbirth, and in many cases endangers herself through this. Ad ki amru, Ishav nishpat shalot tizdakek, to the point that our rabbis speak about the curses that women say when in labor. Lachen b'Noach, therefore in Parshat Noach, ach shedichtiv amar lahem pruvu, even though it says pruvu, halo kativ kodem yivach Elohim et Noach vet banav. Prior to that, it says that Noach and his sons were blessed. Aval Neshem lo iskil, but their wives are not mentioned. And why is so? Because from the moment that the pain of childbirth was introduced to the world, women were dropped, shall we say, from the obligation. Does that make sense? So what he's saying is, the psukim in Bereshit are right for the time of Bereshit. And the psukim of Noach are right for the time of Noach. And that tells us something fascinating, which is, it makes sense now why Rashi, Rambam, Ramban, of Achai Gaon quote the verse from Parshat Noach, because that relates to us. Because that's a more authentic encapsulation of the duty of Provu nowadays. But what makes the author of the Sefer Hachinuch so fascinating is, he knows that. He's not foolish. But for him, the mitzvah begins, is initiated, the source of the mitzvah, the root of the mitzvah is what happened before. Any questions? Now I can see both Cindy's question and Charlotte's question, but we're going to get to that right now.
Rob, Johnny, I think it's a game, that's a game changer.
About, in terms of this, shall we say, evolution of the mitzvah?
Yes, that before the Chet, it wasn't dangerous for women to have children. After the Chet, because of all the, quote unquote curses, it was dangerous for women to have children, and therefore the expectation for her to have a child changed. So while it's her mitzvah to have a child, because it's a beautiful thing and it's pru'urvu, it leaves the onus, she's no longer obligated to have children in such a manner.
Right. Isn't it fascinating? Now, it's interesting. I knew the first half of this Meshech Chochmah, but I never understood the biblical basis of his assertion and how it fits into Parshat Bereshit and Noach. And once you read it, you say, wow.
Yes.
And then you also then say, I now understand what the Sefer Hachinuch is doing. He's not just interested in the legal final proof. He's interested in the spirit of the law. And you know, the spirit of the law does begin with Adam and Chava. Notwithstanding that, he ends by saying a woman is not obliged because he understands the continuation of the law. So his presentation, shall we say, isn't just a snapshot of what is the mitzvah, but it's a broader presentation of the concept of the mitzvah as it begins with Provo in Gan Eden, and as it continues, reflecting on the Chivshua and as it applies later on to the sons of Noah. Now, there was one important thing that I skipped, and I said I was going to get to, which would answer a couple of questions. And this may well blow you away. And he's not the only person who mentioned this, but we're going to see a formal presentation about this in just a second. Because embedded in his discussion, he then says, given all this, v'chen muteret lishtot kos ikrin, k'uvda Yehudit debithu de Rabbi Chanina sof haba al yevamato. So let me translate this. Based on this, it is permitted for a woman to drink some kind of contraceptive medicine that would stop her giving birth, as reflected in the story of Yehudit, the daughter of Rabbi Chanina, which follows that Mishnah and Gemara that we studied. Do you remember we studied that Mishnah and Gemara, and I said it's really interesting, really important, really fascinating, and the truth that continues. And then towards the end of that page, there's an interesting story which I knew we weren't going to have time for, but I knew we were going to reference it here, so I want to point it out. But the implication of all this is that a man is obliged to have a child, but a woman isn't. And a woman can drink kos iklin. You may well say, what? I was told when I was in SEM, your job is to have babies. And you're telling me now, after I've gone through that, by the way, which isn't very helpful, that I could have just basically gone to Bahamas and just been as good as a, observant lady as anything. Now you tell me, well, I'm sorry about that. All complaints, please write to your former head mistress or head teacher. But I want to now quote to you an interesting responsum. You may well know, about a year ago, a volume of halachic answers given by Yoatzot Halacha was published by Nishmat. It's called Nishmat Abayit. I have it here. I wrote a very, very long review about it, in which I summarized a lot of the answers. And in there is an interesting question. And it's a 5-page answer. We're not going to go through it all, but I do want to make reference to the last bit. But in order to understand the conclusion, we need to begin with a question. We've got 10 minutes to go, so that's perfect. A woman asked the following question. This isn't fiction, this happened. A woman called Yoatzet Halacha, picked up the phone and said, I have a question. And as a result of this, this is what she was told. Yesh lanu chamisha yeladim. We have 5 children. Shalosh banot v'shnei banim. We've got 3 daughters and 2 sons. Ani margisha shebahava v'ulai bichlal. She says, I feel presently, and perhaps in general, godel zeh shel hamishpacha hu godel mat'im avuri mibchinot rabot. The size of my family is the right size for me for a whole variety of reasons. Ba'ali sover ki mikivan she'ani zo shenosat et harayon. My husband believes that since I'm the one who carries a child, yoledet, right? Ba'ofen tivi noset b'chelek gadol menatel gidol yadim. I don't just carry the child, I give birth, and I carry the brunt of raising the children in our home. The decision should just be mine. Whatever I decide, he's happy with it. She asks, is it okay? And she's writing to a woman, talking to her probably on the phone, and this is later written down. Is it permitted for me to basically say, enough? And she gives some details, but I want to point out that Ani bat 36, I'm 36 years old, and my years of childbirth are towards the end. And yet I don't think I've got the energy to have another child. Now, I know how some people on the street might respond to such a lady, some friends, some rabbis, but I want to know what the real Jewish view is. And by the way, I want to point out a significant critique of how Jewish law is taught. Oftentimes, Jewish law is taught from the perspective of much of the Jewish literature, which is often instructing the man. And when you read the mitzvah, you realize there's a vast distinction in terms of obligation between a man and woman here. I want to tell you something, by the way. I adore babies. The more babies, the better. So I'm not somebody who's trying to tell people don't have babies, but that's their choice. Nevertheless, on a purely legal context, oftentimes when somebody would answer this, they may well answer it from the perspective of the mitzvah of pruvu, notwithstanding the concluding statement, which is, who does the mitzvah of pruvu apply to in terms of at least a legal obligation? Right? That's not just a Sefer Hachinuch's view, it's a Rambam's view, it's a Gemara's view, right? It's everybody, based on the Chivshur, based on a verse in the Torah. So the answer goes on to 5 pages, and it goes through, by the way, a variety of different verses, because though the mitzvah pruvu may well be an exemption, there are certain wider aspirations to fill the earth. Nevertheless, they say, if that's your wish, Jewish law is very much on your side, and that's totally fine. And at the end of the tshuva, there's an appendix, and I've scanned just this bit of the appendix, which is basically using contraceptives by a woman. How does Jewish law respond to that from the legal perspective of a woman, not from the desire for men to have children or desire for women to have children, on a halachic basis? And it begins with referencing that Gemara that we didn't go through, but it was at the bottom of Samach Amud Bet of Masechet Yevamot, talking about the daughter of Rabbi Yechezkiah, and that is then quoted, and it leads to the following interesting conclusions. And I'm going to stop, and I'd love to hear your thoughts. We can learn from this story, which, forgive me for not going through only because of time, but I want to get to conclusions, and if we have time, I'm happy to go through it again. But the basic notion is she drank this contraceptive medicine and ceased having more children. This story deals with the duty of mitzvah of pruvu for a woman. And from the response of Rabbi, the conclusion is a woman is permitted to drink such a substance. No critique of that conclusion is found in halachic works. By the way, there are some footnotes in the Daf Makorot. I've included the footnotes. Okay, so if you want to check those out, I've made sure that that's there. In the story of the Talmud, which I didn't want to get too much into, the reason why she wanted to refrain was because of pain of childbirth, but it wasn't because of danger of childbirth. That's apparently an important distinction according to some Rishonim. But in these core halachic works, it makes it clear that a woman may refrain from having children. It goes on to say there are some Acharonim who say that's only when there is grave pain, but if that's not the case, that shouldn't be done. Whereas other people don't take that position and basically say, if a person's not obliged, they're not obliged, end of conversation. Now, I want to make something very, very clear. What I've just summarized comes with genuinely no agenda. Say, I love babies, right? But nevertheless, what we need to do is actually understand Jewish law, understand how Jewish law is derived, the verses we draw them from, and the boundaries, the scope, the notion, the nature of obligation. What we've done over the last hour or so is go through the mitzvah of pruvu, understood that there is some fundamental disagreement as to where that law is derived from. Understand that the Mishnah seems to be quite clear about that, but not that the notion that somebody is not obliged means they're not part of the conversation. On the contrary, the conversation begins and ends with her. And it's a very different conversation about the man wishing to have children and the woman choosing to be the bearer of those children. And there are significant implications, more far-reaching than many realize, in terms of Miniyat Harayon for those who wish for that to be their choice. So what I hope we've done here is have a thorough-ish summary of the mitzvah of pruvu. There was one further thing, though, I did say I was going to share, which is why, if there's a mitzvah pruvu on a man, why is he not obliged to do so from age 13? That may seem like a simple question, but when you think about it, if it's a mitzvah, then it's a mitzvah. Do it from age bar mitzvah. So through my research, I saw the author of the Torah Tmima, Baruch Halevi Epstein, offer the following suggestion. Just as a chivshuha is the exemption of a woman in terms of the mitzvah of Puruvu. It's a framing of the mitzvah for the man. What is the chivshua? Actually, it's about conquering, right? Kivush means to conquer, right? To subdue, to conquer. And this is understood to point to the ability to conquer land, to be part of an army. And in the Torah, we say you join the army at age 20, right? And in the Mishnah, we're told a man should marry age 18 and ideally not much later than 20. So that means that the mitzvah Puruvu is also linked to the notion of chivshua, and that's why that age is relevant. And that's why the Sefer Hachinuch, if you recall, says the mitzvah only begins at a time when it's ready for him to marry, which is interpreted according to the Torah Tamimah from that term v'chivshua. So that word plays a key role both in terms of the exemption of women and the obligation of men, but both from the obligation of men, we learn in terms of what a person perhaps should do and endeavor to do. But from the exemption of women, we also learn from a purely legal perspective, something which intuitively a lot of us also know, which is if I'm the one who's carrying the pregnancy, then I'm the one who gets to choose whether to be pregnant. And surely that's something which Jewish law has a view on, and it does. And it does from these sources and from these mitzvot. So we've got a few more minutes to go. Any thoughts you want to share?
I do. I have one. Yeah, but then you're setting up a dialectic which could be very ugly between the man and the woman. The woman who says, I can't do this, and the man says, but I'm obligated. So why would Jewish law, well, I mean, that's a very difficult situation, particularly one is commanded and one isn't. So who gets priority? How do you deal with that?
I mean, I think it's a really important question. And here I'm going to actually speak personally, because I think every couple has to figure certain things out. I think law has its reaches, but within relationships, negotiations have to happen. I don't mean formal legal negotiations. I mean emotional, right? Love-based negotiations in terms of expectations. So yeah, the man can want what he wants, but ultimately he can't enable that, and she's not obliged to just say, go for it. Now, there is, within the Tshuva, I shouldn't ignore it, within the Tshuva it does say there is a wider rabbinic sentiment of basically populating the earth. We said that's a wish of God. That's what the Sefer Hachinuch says. And there's a general understanding this is what everybody would want. But there's a vast difference between surely you'd want that and you are absolutely obliged to do that. And that's where understanding and affection and communication takes place. Mm-hmm. You know, the weird thing is I'm a strong believer that Jewish law actually helps us understand a lot of the complexities of life. I believe that if we don't understand that tension, then lots of tensions really arise in marriages, and basically a woman thought, well, it's my obligation, end of conversation. It's not that way. And we need to know what the law does require and what the law doesn't require, whom it's talking to, and why certain people are or not obliged. Again, and I think the Meshech Chochmah is compelling. Yeah, there was originally an obligation on both, and then things change because things change.
Mm-hmm.
I want to take it a step further, but with conversation and everything, if the woman is around that she is not able to have children emotionally or whatever reasons, then he can use it as grounds for divorce if he can, because he needs and wants to fulfill that mitzvah. So it makes it, I am totally for the women having the choice and it not being obligated on her, but it makes things more complicated, especially in this day and age where it generally has one wife.
Right. So interestingly, some people say maybe this was the case prior to the Cherem of Rabbeinu Gershom, where men could have more wives. Maybe this doesn't quite operate this way today. Meaning, it's important to know that there's a lot more to this than even what I've said. We've only had an hour, 10 minutes, and our scope has been to both understand the Sefer Hachinuch, understand the biblical verses, and then in our final analysis, touch on this wider conversation. So I'm not trying to simplify things, and I'm very happy to send whomever would like the full Tshuva from Nishmat Habayit, which I think if you really want to understand this topic, you have to read. I'm not suggesting that should be ignored. But nevertheless, there are still clear implications from even the Sefer Hachinuch's presentation, and people should know that when a mitzvah book says a person is obligated, isn't obligated, there are other sides to that story as well. And this is one which not the Yamshar Shlomo, the Marshal talks about, and as we saw, the Meshech Chochmah talks about. They don't hide it, they say it very clearly. So we need to see it in its wider picture, etc., etc.
Well, I have a question also.
Before you ask your question, though, can I just interrupt for 1 second? I'm going to stop the recording, and you're welcome to continue with questions. I just want to announce that I put in the link to register. So if anyone wants to register for the course, I also am letting you know that if you're staying on for if you're staying on for Shani's class or Rabbi Liebtag's class, you can stay on this link. You don't have to exit and come back. We will pause in between. You're welcome to stay on, and please continue, if it's okay with Rab Johnny, to ask him questions as long as he's able to stay, and we haven't started the next year.
So firstly, thank you so much, Melissa, and thank you so much for your assistance. And I'm free for the next 10 minutes, whoever wants to continue. In fact, just before we do so, I want to just point out 2 things. I hope these shirim are not, sorry, these are not meant to be ends of conversations. They're meant to be beginnings of conversations. I've always believed that. And that's why on my Daf Makor, my email is there. And that's why in 1 second, I put my cell phone number if you want to WhatsApp me questions. So it's important to know that even whatever we do in an hour, 10 minutes, especially when dealing with law, practical law, to think that we can address all questions, I think is hopeful and possibly even presumptuous. So please know that while I'm happy to talk for a little longer, if you have more questions, queries, feel free to contact me, and I'd love to talk.
I've got